Right now, as you watch this, more than 600 ships are stranded in the Persian Gulf. They cannot leave. The gate is closed. The gate is 21 miles wide. It sits between Iran and Oman, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, where the water narrows to a passage barely wide enough for 2 lanes of supertanker traffic separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. Every day, under normal conditions, roughly 135 ships pass through it. They carry 20% of the world's oil supply. 1/5 of everything that keeps the lights on, the factories running, and the planes in the air. On February the 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched airstrikes across Iran and killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. In retaliation, Iran's Revolutionary Guards declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. They issued warnings on VHF radio that passage was not allowed. They laid mines. They attacked merchant ships. They fired on tankers with drones. And within days, the most important waterway on Earth went dark. No tanker signals, no traffic, nothing. On April the 8th, a fragile 2-week ceasefire was announced. Iran agreed to reopen the strait. As of today, it has not. The strait is operating at roughly 10% of normal capacity. Iran is charging tolls of over $1 million per ship. Over 600 vessels, including more than 300 tankers, remain trapped inside the Gulf. And 2 days ago, Iranian drones hit a pumping station on Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline, the bypass route that was supposed to keep oil flowing to the world even when Hormuz was shut. Saudi production capacity has been cut by 600,000 barrels per day. The pipeline's throughput has dropped by 700,000 barrels per day. Even the backup is bleeding. The world is discovering, in real time, what analysts have warned about for decades. The Strait of Hormuz is the most dangerous single point of failure in the global economy, and there is no plan B. This is the story of 21 miles of water. Who has fought for them? Who has died in them? And why closing them can bring the modern world to a halt. To understand why this narrow strip of water controls the fate of nations, you have to understand what it connects and what it traps. The Persian Gulf is a shallow, enclosed sea. It is roughly 600 miles long and 200 miles wide, bordered by Iran to the north and the Arabian Peninsula to the south. Beneath its seabed and the land surrounding it lie 65 to 75% of the world's confirmed oil reserves and 35 to 50% of its natural gas. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Iran all export their hydrocarbons through or across this body of water. And there is only one way out. The Strait of Hormuz is approximately 120 miles long and narrows to just 21 miles at its western end, between Iran's Qeshm Island and the Omani Musandam Peninsula. Within that 21-mile gap, the navigable channel for deep-draft supertankers is even tighter. 2 shipping lanes, each 2 miles wide, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. With an average depth of roughly 164 feet, the waterway is shallow enough to be a navigational nightmare but deep enough to accommodate the largest tankers on Earth. Because the Gulf is an enclosed sea, there is no alternative water route. If this gate closes, the oil stays locked inside. This is not a new problem. Whoever controls these waters has controlled the flow of wealth for 5 centuries. In 1507, the Portuguese commander Afonso de Albuquerque recognized that Hormuz Island was the key to the entire Indian Ocean trade network. Portugal colonized the island and held it for over a century, using it as the hub of a maritime empire that stretched from Lisbon to Goa. In 1622, the Persian Shah Abbas, with British naval assistance, expelled the Portuguese. The Omanis followed, driving Portugal out of Muscat in 1650 and building a maritime power that reached the coast of East Africa. For the next 2 centuries, Persians and Omanis fought over these waters. Then the British arrived. In the early 1800s, the Royal Navy moved into the Gulf to suppress piracy and protect the sea routes to India. Through a series of treaties with the small sheikdoms along the southern coast, the Trucial States, which would later become the United Arab Emirates, Britain turned the Persian Gulf into a British lake. For nearly 140 years, the Royal Navy kept the peace, the oil flowed, and London kept order. In 1971, Britain pulled out. Every soldier, every ship, every garrison east of Suez gone. The most strategically important waterway on Earth suddenly had no policemen. Under the Nixon Doctrine, the United States outsourced Gulf security to the Shah of Iran, handing him an unlimited blank check to buy any weapon in the American arsenal. If you have seen our earlier series on Iran, you know how that ended. The Shah fell, the revolution came, and the Strait became, for the first time in the modern era, a contested battleground. The first modern war fought over the Strait of Hormuz began not with a naval battle, but with an act of economic desperation. By 1984, the Iran-Iraq War had been grinding for 4 years with no end in sight. Saddam Hussein, unable to break the stalemate on land, decided to strangle Iran's economy from the sea. Using French-built super-étendard jets armed with Exocet anti-ship missiles, Iraq began attacking Iranian oil tankers and the facilities at Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal. Iran retaliated by attacking the only targets it could reach, the tankers belonging to Iraq's financial backers, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. On May 13, 1984, Iranian F-4 Phantoms struck the Kuwaiti tanker Kasbah, and the tanker war began. Over the next 4 years, more than 500 ships would be attacked in these waters. Kuwait made a masterstroke of Cold War diplomacy. It asked both the Soviet Union and the United States for protection, knowing that Washington would never allow Moscow to establish a naval presence in the Gulf. The Reagan administration took on the entire job. The result was Operation Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy operation since the Second World War. The commitment was enormous. Carrier battle groups, cruisers, minesweepers, and escort frigates poured into the Gulf. The price in blood came early. On May 17, 1987, the USS Stark, commanded by Captain Glenn Brindle, was struck by 2 Iraqi Exocet missiles. 37 American sailors were killed. Iraq called it a mistake. Washington accepted the apology. The mission continued. Iran, realizing it could not win a conventional fight against the United States Navy, turned to the weapon it understood best, the mine. On September 21, 1987, American forces caught the Iranian vessel Iran Ajr red-handed, laying mines in the shipping lanes to Bahrain. The crisis peaked on April 14, 1988. The frigate USS Samuel B., commanded by Captain Paul Rinn, struck an Iranian M8 mine while returning from convoy escort duty. The explosion blew a 22-foot hole in the hull and broke the ship's keel. 10 sailors were severely burned or injured. The crew's damage control efforts saved the ship. 4 days later, the United States launched Operation Praying Mantis, the largest American naval engagement since the Second World War. The targets were Iranian oil platforms at Sasson and Siri that had been used as coordination centers for attacks on shipping. Both were destroyed. The Iranian missile boat Joshan, commanded by Captain Abbas Malik, challenged the American cruiser Wainwright by firing a Harpoon anti-ship missile. It missed. The American fleet responded with overwhelming force, sinking the Joshan with most of her crew. The Iranian frigate Sahand was intercepted by a 6-intruder aircraft from the carrier USS Enterprise and struck by 3 Harpoon missiles and multiple bombs. She burned and sank, with 45 of her crew dead. The frigate Sabalan, whose captain had earned the nickname Captain Nasty for his habit of targeting the crew quarters of merchant ships, was hit by a laser-guided bomb that dropped straight down her smokestack. Defense Secretary Frank Carlucci and Admiral William Crowe ordered a ceasefire to avoid further destruction, and the crippled Sabalan was towed back to port. In a single afternoon, the United States destroyed or crippled half of Iran's operational navy. The lesson Tehran absorbed was not defeat, it was adaptation. Conventional capital ships were vulnerable, large platforms were targets. The next time Iran fought in these waters, it would not use frigates and destroyers, it would use swarms. But the tanker war ended with something worse than a battle. On July 3, 1988, the cruiser, USS Vincennes, was engaged in a surface skirmish with Iranian gunboats in the Strait. In the confusion, the crew misidentified a climbing civilian airliner as a descending Iranian F-14 fighter. Captain William Rogers gave the order to fire. 2 missiles destroyed Iran Air Flight 655. All 290 passengers and crew were killed, including 66 children. The tragedy, combined with Iraq's use of chemical weapons on the battlefield, convinced Ayatollah Khomeini to accept a ceasefire. The first war for the Strait of Hormuz was over, but the tactical lessons it taught Iran would define the next 40 years. After Praying Mantis, Iran rebuilt its approach to the Strait from the ground up. The question was no longer how to match the American Navy ship for ship. The question was how to make the Strait so dangerous that no navy, no matter how powerful, could keep it open without paying an unacceptable price. The answer was asymmetric warfare, and the force built to wage it was not the regular Iranian Navy. It was the IRGC Navy, a separate branch controlled by the Revolutionary Guards, ideologically driven, and designed for one purpose: to turn 21 miles of water into a killing ground. The two forces served different roles. The regular Islamic Republic of Iran Navy operates conventional warships in the open waters of the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. The IRGC Navy owns the strait itself. It operates from a network of fortified islands, Keshem, Larak, Abu Musa, that have been transformed into what military planners call static warships, bristling with tunnels, underground missile bunkers, concealed launch sites, and prepositioned mine stockpiles. The primary weapon is the swarm. Hundreds of small, fast attack boats, fiberglass, Ashura-class craft, Swedish-built boghammers fitted with rocket launchers, operate in horseshoe-shaped formations designed to surround and overwhelm a large warship from every direction simultaneously. The boats are cheap, expendable, and nearly impossible to track in the cluttered radar environment of a narrow strait with heavy commercial traffic. The IRGC calls this mosaic defense. Small, autonomous units operating independently, so that destroying any single node does not degrade the network. Behind the swarms sit layered anti-ship cruise missile batteries. The Noor, an upgraded variant of the Chinese C-802, can be fired from shore positions, trucks, or helicopters. The RAD is a longer-range missile designed to fly low and perform evasive maneuvers. These batteries are positioned along the Iranian coastline in hardened shelters, ready to fire on any warship that enters the strait. Below the surface, the Ghadir-class midget submarine, a 200-ton littoral predator armed with torpedoes, patrols the shallow, acoustically noisy waters of the Gulf, where conventional sonar struggles to distinguish a submarine from the background clutter, and beneath everything lies the mine. Iran considers covert mine laying one of its most critical capabilities. Its stockpile includes variants of the Russian-designed M8 contact mine, the same type that nearly sank the Samuel B. in 1988. Using civilian fishing boats, fast craft, or even commercial dhows, the IRGC can saturate the shipping lanes with mines in a matter of hours. Clearing a sophisticated minefield in a 21-mile strait, under fire from shore batteries and fast boat swarms, could take weeks. That is the calculation that makes Hormuz the most dangerous choke point on Earth. The United States Navy could eventually reopen the strait, but the time it would take, the ships it would lose, and the oil that would not flow during the clearing operation would be catastrophic for the global economy. Iran does not need to win a naval war. It needs to close the gate long enough to make the world scream. In 2019, Iran demonstrated exactly how this doctrine works in practice. In May and June, limpet mines damaged multiple oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman. In June, an IRGC surface-to-air missile shot down an American RQ-4, a Global Hawk surveillance drone over the strait. The United States came within minutes of launching retaliatory strikes before the order was called off. In July, IRGC commandos fast-roped from helicopters to seize the British-flagged tanker Stena Impero. And in September, a coordinated swarm of drones and cruise missiles struck Saudi Aramco's processing facilities at Abqaiq and Kurais, temporarily cutting Saudi production by 5 million barrels per day. Each incident was calibrated. None crossed the threshold into open war. All of them demonstrated that Iran could disrupt the global oil supply at will, from the water, the air, or the land. The doctrine was not theoretical. It was operational. And in February of 2026, Iran finally pulled the trigger. On February the 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched airstrikes across Iran. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. Senior IRGC commanders were killed. Military and nuclear sites were struck across the country. Iran's response came on multiple fronts. Ballistic missiles were fired at Israel, at American military bases across the Gulf, and at the Gulf states that host them. But the most consequential retaliation did not involve a single missile aimed at a military target. It involved a radio transmission. On VHF Channel 16, the International Maritime Distress Frequency, the IRGC, began broadcasting a single message to every ship in the Persian Gulf. Passage through the Strait of Hormuz is not allowed. On March the 2nd, the IRGC officially confirmed the closure and threatened to set fire to any vessel that attempted to cross. It was not a bluff. The IRGC launched confirmed attacks on at least 21 merchant ships. Mines were laid in the shipping lanes. Drone strikes hit tankers. Within days, no commercial vessel was broadcasting an identification signal in the strait. The gate was closed. The economic impact was instantaneous. Insurance companies pulled war risk coverage for the strait, making it financially impossible for any commercial operator to send a ship through, even if the captain was willing to try. Oil prices surged past records set during every previous crisis. More than 800 vessels were trapped inside the Gulf, unable to leave. The world scrambled for alternatives. Saudi Arabia activated its East-West pipeline, a 1,200-kilometer line running from the Gulf Coast to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, capable of carrying up to 7 million barrels per day. The UAE pushed crude through the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, which bypasses the strait entirely by running oil to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. Iraq increased flows through its pipeline to Ceyhan in Turkey. But the maths did not work. Even at maximum capacity, the bypass pipelines could compensate for roughly 5 to 6 million barrels per day. The strait normally carries 20 million. That left a deficit of 14 million barrels per day that could not be replaced by any means. And then, Iran attacked the backup. On April the 8th, hours after a ceasefire was announced, Iranian drones struck a pumping station on the Saudi East-West pipeline. In the days that followed, further attacks hit the Manifa oil field, cutting 300,000 barrels per day of capacity. Previous strikes on the Kurais facility had already cut another 300,000. Refineries at Ras Tanura, Jubail, Yanbu, and Riyadh were hit. Total Saudi production capacity was reduced by 600,000 barrels per day, and East-West pipeline throughput dropped by 700,000 barrels per day. The message was clear. Even the alternative routes are within reach. As of today, April the 11th, 2026, the ceasefire is fragile. The strait is nominally reopening, but traffic remains at roughly 10% of normal. Iran is charging tolls of over $1 million per ship and requiring coordination with its armed forces before granting passage. Over 600 vessels remain stranded. The ADNOC chief executive, Sultan Ahmed Al-Jaber, said it plainly. The Strait of Hormuz is not open. Access is being restricted, conditioned, and controlled. That is not freedom of navigation. That is coercion. U.S. and Iranian negotiators are expected in Islamabad this weekend for talks. The key question is not whether the ceasefire will hold. The key question is whether the world will ever look at this 21-mile strip of water the same way again. Here is what the world has learned, at enormous cost, in the space of 6 weeks. The Strait of Hormuz was always a single point of failure. Analysts said so for decades. Wargame exercises proved it. The Millennium Challenge wargame in 2002, in which a simulated Iranian commander sank an entire American carrier battle group using swarm tactics and unconventional weapons, demonstrated that the strait could not be held open without catastrophic risk. The simulation was so embarrassing that the Pentagon reset the exercise and ordered the opposing force to stop using effective tactics. The warning was ignored. No major alternative infrastructure was built. The global economy continued to push 20 million barrels per day through a corridor narrower than the length of Manhattan, defended by one country's navy against another country's mines, drones, and fast boats. The reason is simple, and it is damning. After the Suez Crisis of 1956, the oil industry concluded that pipelines were too vulnerable to political risk because they crossed national borders where they could be sabotaged or held hostage. The industry pivoted to supertankers, believing that ships operating in international waters were safer than pipes running through unstable countries. The entire global energy system was redesigned around a 300,000-ton ship passing through a 21-mile gap. For 70 years, the bet paid off. The strait stayed open, the oil flowed, the supertanker was king, and nobody built the backup. February of 2026 ended that bet. The gate closed. The oil stopped. The pipelines that existed could not compensate. The alternatives that should have been built decades ago did not exist. And the world discovered, in the most expensive way possible, that the most important 21 miles on Earth had no redundancy, no fallback, and no plan. 500 years ago, the Portuguese recognized that whoever holds Hormuz holds the world's trade. 140 years ago, the British understood that controlling these waters meant controlling the global order. 50 years ago, the Americans outsourced that control to a Shah who fell within a decade. And today, the strait is controlled by neither side. It is held hostage by the geography itself, a 21-mile bottleneck that no empire has ever fully secured and no technology has ever replaced. The world runs on oil, the oil runs through Hormuz, and Hormuz, right now, is closed.